discuss the global standards process, the challenges to it, as well as the role of nation states in developing global standards, we have an esteemed panel with us here today. First, we have Dan Rosen, who is the founding partner of Rhodium Group. Orville Schell, the Arthur Ross Director of the Center for U.S.-Chinese Relations at the Asia Center in New York. Rob Strayer, an Executive Vice President of Policy at the Information Technology Industry Council. And Rama Iluru, a Senior Director at the Special Competitive Studies Project. Gordon Gillerman, the Director for Standards Coordination Office at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is our moderator today, and I'll turn it over to him now. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank the Leadership IP team for organizing this and thinking standards is important enough to have a whole panel on. So it's interesting, again, that there's a whole panel on standards. I've worked in standards since I came out of university, both in the private sector and in the public sector, and we were usually the sleepy little world that nobody else knew about that impacted everything we all do in our everyday lives. So it's terrific to be here. One of my observations is that in the government, we've talked about standards with a real focus on standards' impact on trade for years. Standards were at the cornerstone of technical trade barriers and trade negotiations, discussions related to those things. And now the conversation has shifted, and it's shifted to innovation. It's shifted to issues that affect both national economic and national security. And so it really makes standards in a different light. And so I'm very pleased to be here with my esteemed panel to talk about the issues related to what's going on in the world of standards and the dynamic environment that's happening in the world of standards. With that, we can let our panelists give their opening remarks, and we'll go ahead and start here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I have never really worked on standards, except as a generalist, looking at the Chinese economy, the system, how it's evolved over time, and certainly standards was one of 1,000 elements, right, that goes in to the mix there. And today it's very much front and center, as you note. There's a lot of focus in the literature on making sure that we don't get the role of government wrong in thinking about the whole topic of technical standards. And I think the problem isn't necessarily government and government's role here in technical standards. Obviously, with China and the European Union both have a more government-forward approach than we do. The problem is the kind of government and the mindset of government, the chromosomes, if you will, in the character, quality of government participation in the issue. Engagement with China, our posture towards China over the past nearly 5 decades, really, and certainly including in standards development organizations today, was contingent on the notion that Beijing and Washington had a common view of the role of markets, the limits of government industrial policy, right, in shaping economic outcomes. Not just a common verbiage and willingness to say the same things, but it actually required that we believe, that China really did believe, that the degree of statism it had used in the past was not in its own interest, and that it wanted to migrate in our direction. China didn't have to be there, but it had to be committed to heading there, to getting there, and there meaning a overwhelmingly market-determined system for deciding outcomes, including in standard making. The problem of our time now is that there is a demonstrable change in where China is headed. I happen not to think that it's set in stone, as I think Sue Schwab noted at the outset. There's a lot of things that are wronger with the Chinese model than we thought just a little while ago, than most people thought. And I think those things are coming home to roost very quickly, and there's necessarily going to have to be a big shift in Chinese direction away from this turn back toward an overheavy role for the state in determining everything in a direction that we're going to like. That could or could not happen, though. We can't be sure about it. For the time being, we do have a clear and present reason to be concerned about what's happening. That requires that we move past debating whether we have a concern about China's participation in things like standards development organizations, and decide what adjustments are required now on our part, getting that right. Otherwise, in my view, it's not so much that China's going to take over these organizations, flooding them with people, and it's just a head count of like, how many guys with a red flag and the yellow stars are in the room. It's more of an erosion of the quality and reliability, our ability to be confident in SDOs to generate the right kind of outcomes to support our interests and the wellspring of our prosperity and success, and not just ours, but anybody who learned from the 20th century the lessons that there's a real danger in over-politicizing how you run the economy. So that concerns market systems generally, actually. It's not just standards, but in all regards, how we hoped to engage with China in dealing with international norms, creation, management, all that kind of stuff, changes as a result of this unfortunate difference today in where China is really trying to head versus where there was still, a pretty sizable camp that believed as much in the centrality of markets as we do. Just a few years ago, those folks are having an awfully hard time making their case today. Another minute here just to finish up, an opening couple thoughts. I think it's quite premature to aspire today to a broad reconfiguration of the SDO, of the technical standards landscape. I think it's premature to do that for two reasons. One, as I said, I think it's too soon to guess the full extent of China's deflection from a kind of commercially oriented marketization process as the predominant objective that it has. It's too soon to guess that. The present degree of statism is clearly failing, in my opinion, in China, and it will change, but we can't be confident of when and exactly how. And we have to act now, but not, can't really say exactly what the whole landscape is going to look like here. And secondly, even among us, within and among the market economies, it's too soon to be certain what changes to technical standard setting traditions are going to be optimal in light of long-term technological change that's taking place. Somebody said, as we were discussing the topic yesterday, that it's hard to go ahead and sort of skip to the next generation of the right answers when the technology itself is evolving in real time at the same time you're trying to do that. So we have to be somewhat modest for that reason. And also because of the domestic political reevaluations taking place on the appropriate balance between national security and potential prosperity. That is a subjective question that every society grapples with. We're going through a period where that's been reopened for debate in all sorts of ways. And until some of those things are resolved, it's going to be tough to say what's the optimal place to land in terms of changing the environment. But there are a number of principles that are even clear to a non-lifelong technology standards expert like myself. First, make the problem smaller. You do not have a universal problem of China's participation in global standard setting. Absolutely not. The vast majority of ongoing processes are probably adequate to secure our interests for the time being. There are no doubt some, however, that do deserve much more acute attention. Make the problem smaller and you'll have more resources available to deal with those special cases that are still the exception, I think, where more attention is needed. Secondly, and it's also been said very clearly earlier, given the reality of nation-state-based systemic competition taking place, we're not unscrambling this omelet. It is going to continue to be put together here, intertwined here between the national security side and the commercial side to an entirely different magnitude than any of us expected over the first, in my case, 3 decades of my career. And third and final, transparency, science-based objectivity in how we make that evaluation of where there is a China problem or any other kind of institutional problem where there's not is absolutely critical. The debate over decoupling between the United States and China that we've had in this country, in this city, on this block, in fact, over the past 4 years was done entirely without a cost-benefit analysis of decoupling. Nobody costed out what it would even mean. Nobody's even modeled or operationalized, as we would say, what decoupling even means, right? So only now do we start to realize what the prices are, what the realities are, if you try to pull things apart gratuitously, excessively. We have a lot of thinking work to do and analytic work to do to sit down and do this the right way. Thank you.
Thank you. Orville.
Well, let me just sort of depart maybe from where Dan began. I think it's really important for us to try to understand where we are, because we are indeed at a point of immense inflection, I think. And how did we get here? It's also important to remember that something which may seem very anodyne to most people, like standard setting agencies, exist within this larger sort of atmosphere of geopolitics. And Dan alluded to the fact that we once were under the operating system, if you will, of engagement. And what was that all about? Well, I remember going to the World Economic Forum year after year, and the glories of globalization. It was a win-win for everybody. Didn't matter where things were made, who made them, as long as you could get them quickly and reliably. And that was then. I think now we have to recognize that when we talk about something like standards, as we are here, that the main player is, of course, us and China. And engagement has become unraveled. This was a system initiated not by name, but by sort of the Bethlehem moment when Kissinger and Nixon went to China in 1972. And thereafter, 9 presidential administrations all backed the idea of engagement. And what was its supposition? Its supposition was that, you remember Francis Fukuyama and the end of history, that there was a kind of a teleology going forward, and we're all on the same flow of history, and Chinese reform had made it imaginable that China wouldn't become a carbon copy of us, but slowly was evolving to be more convergent. And this meant that we wanted to embrace them in every conceivable organization we could, in the economy, in our academic life, think tank life, and we were rather reckless about that. And yet, one of the things I think we fail to appreciate is that when a country like China has a revolution as profound as China did under Mao Zedong, it is not something that you simply wave away when a Deng Xiaoping appears in the late 70s and early 80s and says, whoops, we made some errors, let's try something else. That it is actually something that remains deep in the soul of the country. And now we see that it is being re-expressed again, something like a recessive gene. And that is because Xi Jinping is really a product of that revolution. That's when he came of age, in the 60s, in the 70s, and that's when he acquired his toolkit. Never went abroad to study, doesn't speak a foreign language, does not feel particularly comfortable in sort of the cosmopolitan world of the G20. He relies on ritual, relies on formality, relies on impressing, I think, other leaders, not with his own acumen as a giver and a taker, which is the essence of diplomacy, but more, this is who we are. I don't feel particularly comfortable negotiating in the way that maybe the Europeans do with the Americans, the transatlantic alliance, even in the trans-Pacific alliance. And so we're confronting a situation now, I think, where we have to recognize that it's a tipping point moment, and we're not quite sure where we're headed. We're not quite sure how much to embrace China within all of the organs of global society that we once were so willing to to which we're so willing to admit them. And this, I think, is going to have a profound effect on how we set standards, because the truth is that China does not accidentally want to join all these organizations just out of the milk of human kindness. They want to join it because they have an agenda. And I think we need to understand what that agenda is, how it's evolving, and how it might impact our national security and also our intellectual property, all of these things. So as we begin to see the trend, and I think here the Ukraine is a very important new element, we begin to see the wind blowing in a certain direction where China is going ever more, sort of becoming more friendly with Russia and is not delaminating from Russia. And both of those very large and important countries do have their own field of gravity, politically speaking. And that field of gravity is going to be pulling all of these agencies and organs, whether it's in the UN or such as we're discussing here today, in a direction that we need to understand. It's not neutral. And it's going to be essential for us to not eschew them and push them aside, but to figure out where they can be embraced, and to understand what embracing them will mean in terms of the outcomes. So I think we're in a very new world here, and a world which, I'm sorry to say, geopolitics is unavoidable. And NIST may have just been chugging along thinking, well, it doesn't really matter, what these geopolitical realities are. Now I think the time has come when we do have to confront them. And we may find that we have to exist more in a somewhat divided world, a world we don't welcome, we don't advocate, we wish we could avoid, but I think that is the inevitable trend of the future. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Rob.
Great. Gordon, thank you for moderating this panel and your leadership over many years at NIST. I also want to thank leadership for sponsoring this. From 2017 to 2020, I was at the State Department. I led diplomatic outreach with other governments about cybersecurity and about technology competition. I'm now with ITI, as Gordon mentioned, which is a trade association for the largest and most innovative 80 tech companies in the world. So I've had a lot of time to think about technology policy, technology competition, and the geopolitics of that, as well as where that intersects with standards. I think, and to say something that I think many of you in the room already know, sort of the first principles, how to have the most innovative technology of the future in the most important sectors will require much more R&D. Massive amounts of R&D go to achieving the most innovative tech along the way. So whether it's hardware or software, it's relying on that IP that has to be developed through a lot of work. And the only reason that money is available for that massive amount of R&D is that the revenues can be generated worldwide. That is, technology is a story of scale. So we need to keep having the scale in the industry. I'm very much aware, as I think everyone is, that we've heard from today about the tactics that the Chinese have deployed relative to technology. We know they put massive subsidies into some sectors or subsectors in particular. They do cyber-enabled intellectual property theft. They have forced technology transfer. They have discriminatory licensing. Now, along with that, though, we have a standards regime that benefits Western companies because they can keep a global market. They don't have to make a particular product or differentiate their service based on specific localities. We want to keep as much as possible the trend of that global market. So the real solution to all of those concerns with China are trade tools and political tools that address those frictions with China. So we should address cyber-enabled intellectual property theft. The West doesn't do that, China does. We need to figure out ways to address each of those things. We should not allow standards to be collateral damage in those discussions about how to enforce our Western rules-based order views about how each of those sort of economic policies should be addressed. Turning to what I think the US government can do, one is, there are two types of standards bodies. There's the private sector-led ones, and there's thousands of those out there if you count official SDOs and industry-led consortia. Then there's also the multilateral ones led by government. Probably the best known of those is the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, was started back in 1865. It is still around. It still seeks to set standards for technology and other standards. I had the privilege of leading the last major meeting of that. Was 4 years ago, where some countries wanted to say that the ITU should set standards for emerging technologies, for AI. We were successful in pushing back on that. For the last 8 years, the ITU has been led by a Chinese citizen, to Orville's point about the Chinese wanting to have UN positions. They have a senior position there, and fortunately this year, which will set the roadmap for the next 4 years, there's a US citizen running during Bogdan Martin to lead that organization. It's important the US and the West gather together to make sure that organization stays on the right track and doesn't infringe on the private sector-led processes that are industry-led. The other thing that can clearly be done is government can participate more in international standards organizations. That doesn't mean they become government-dominated. It means they have a seat at the table. And the reason they need to be there is they need to have visibility into what's going on. So in those cases, as Dan mentioned, singling out those cases where there are manipulation of the rules or there is block voting by a particular country, the government should be there to see what's going on, to be aware of that, and to maybe raise that issue with another government. They can also be there to ensure the government, a lot of these standards could follow through and become regulation or be useful for government regulators. So it's important that government can be there to say, we're regulating this area. We want to make sure that this standard is being developed is fit for purpose, that it's the right kind of characterization, classification, that it will be useful down the road. The United States government, aside from, I think, NIST and DoD, which I saw participate in a lot of standards bodies, is absent in many of standards proceedings they should be involved in. So I think you can increase both participation and funding for the US government to participate in those. So with that.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirti and leadership, for having me here today, and Gordon for moderating. This is the first conference that I've been at where IP and standards was connected to national security. It's time. Given the geopolitics and where we are in the global competition, not only do we need to have these conferences, but we need to have our leaders and our policymakers acknowledge the importance of intellectual property and standards to national security and to act on that importance. So I am a patent attorney. I spent many years at the Patent Trademark Office as an administrative patent judge. I was detailed to the National Security Commission on AI, where the previous panelist, Katarina McFarland, was a commissioner. And that was an independent commission stood up by Congress. And the chairman of that commission was Eric Schmidt, the former Google chairman. And we issued a final report in last year that was a very comprehensive national strategy for the US to maintain its leadership in national security and AI. When that commission dissolved, Eric Schmidt, upon talking to Henry Kissinger, decided that some of that work needed to be continued. So he stood up the Special Competitive Studies Project and funds it where I am now, working on social implications of AI as well as intellectual property. And the resounding conclusion of both the commission as well as the SCSP is that we are facing an aggressive economic and military competitor in China that is trying to close the lead that we have in emerging technologies. And if we don't change this trajectory, in the 2030s, we will be facing a country that has a bigger economy, more research and development resources, better research, and wider emerging technology deployment. China's approach is twofold. First, they do want to decrease their reliance on foreign technology so they are not vulnerable to export controls or supply chain choke points. And this has also been amplified in the last few weeks by the sanctions that have been placed on Russia. And they're also trying to create externalities where other foreign countries are dependent on them for their technologies, and they're using their primacy in the global supply chain to make this happen, for example, through the Digital Silk Road. The Special Competitive Studies Project has made a net assessment of this competition in certain sectors. And for example, in telecom infrastructure, led by Huawei, they're leading. TikTok, a Chinese social media platform, is the biggest social media platform in the United States. They're also leading in the manufacturing of lithium-ion batteries. And drone sales in the United States is mostly by China. Think about that. Think about the implications of that. So we need to elevate IP standards to a national security priority, and highly recommend everyone look at that final report for other recommendations that, for example, that Josh just mentioned about making sure that standard setting development processes are participatory. You have to show up if you want your interests to be heard. So we need to make sure that the government is coordinating that effort in industry so that small businesses and medium-sized businesses, perhaps through grants, are actually showing up at these standard development organizations and expressing their interests. We need to see maybe establish a federal advisory committee so that experts from academia and industry can advise on these national strategies of how we can pursue national standard setting strategies to support national security. Thank you
very much. So one of the themes that I heard here that I've also heard in many of the standards discussions I've been in is that robust research and development leads to cutting edge technology, and the contributions of cutting edge technology are the most influential thing in technology standards. I grew up in a customer service organization in the private sector before I came to the government in mid-career. So with that ethos, I want to ask questions from our customers here in the audience first before we take them from the moderator. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and you'll get a wireless microphone. One right here in the middle.
So my question is around more kind of tactical strategy that US can deploy. I mean, clearly there are a lot of issues around long-term, we are talking about 2030s, but what should the US do in the next 2 to 3 years so that 5 years from now, we are not at the same stage, kind of talking about the next 5, 10 years, about the same type of issues. And so what's your advice or how companies should be thinking about the tactical issues in the next 2 or 3 years? Thanks.
Thank you. Can you identify yourself and your
Sorry,
organization?
Chetan Sharma Consulting.
Thank you. And Rob, can you field that one first?
Yeah, aside from seeing more participation in standards bodies, I think we did focus on research and development, and we have something that's sitting in front of Congress. It's been sitting there for more than a year, which is the CHIPS Act. So $50 billion that will fund chips research and 5G research that should be passed expeditiously. I mean, I think right now many people think best case scenarios before the August recess. It needs to happen faster. Of course, along with chips will be this entire $100 billion authorized but not funded for other technology sectors. I think we need to think smartly about which strategic subsectors we need to have additional government funding in. It's always going to be the case that the vast majority of R&D money comes from the private sector. We need to figure out how to use government's tools to help juice up some of that spending in strategic national priorities, especially where we know that other adversary countries are funding in those specific sectors. And I also think we need to make sure that money is available for collaboration with Europeans and others who have taken on to this mantra of technological sovereignty. We need to show them that we're better together, joining our markets together, joining our researchers together, joining our academic and industrial players to produce cutting edge technology. So I think that's what we need to have a new focus on in Congress and administration.
Thank you. Daniel?
I have one pet project right now to add to that. That's a little. It is tactical, really, but it's a little bit more diffuse, and that is, drawing an analogy from the strategy that's been taken with Russia and Ukraine, which is rather than saying I have the power to stop this, to solve this, to prevent this from happening, flooding the zone with transparency and information so that people are forced to have a more fact-delimited, conscious, thoughtful discussion of whose responsibility a problem is, and the collective interest in working together to have to solve it. So to apply that to the Chinese case, us not showing up in standard setting bodies, not being present to take notes, to be part of the conversation, to take back with us an awareness of where the priorities are and where they're not, that's basically ceding the ability to be analytic and purposeful in this space entirely. That's just one example of it. I can think of 100 ways where we can turn up the transparency and analytic sort of mindfulness about this issue.
Thank you. Rama?
Sure. So the United States can't do this alone. We need our allies and partners. So I spent the last week in Brussels talking to the Europeans about some of these issues, and the resounding message is that we need to work together and agree to agree and see where we can find broad agreements instead of concentrating on where we disagree. But finding places where we can work together and then moving out from there.
Thank you. So
And
I'll
Gordon-
resonate with those remarks just because I'm currently leading our engagement with the State Department and other parts of commerce, both with the Europeans and with the Quad countries. So we are already looking to work with our allies and partners in standards. Wonderful.
One extremely important element of this is even as we move towards a more adversarial relationship with China, and I think what's happening in the Ukraine has tremendous sort of blowback on that effect. We also have to recognize that what's made this country truly innovative is immigrants and students from all over the world, particularly in the fields of technology. And the question is that if we are going to be heading into this world where we're going to be in a greater state of contention, how do we protect that commons and that immense resource in the research and development side of things, which has been made almost every aspect of our sort of technological life as America what it is today.
Excellent. Thank you. More questions from the audience? Yes, in the center again.
Hi, this is Prakash Sangam from Tantra Analyst. So my question is more on the standard side, and I'm a 3GPP member. When you go there, if you look at voting on be it contributions or chairmanships or repertoires and such, the voting happens in blocks, especially from Chinese side, right? So you have non-Chinese companies fighting against each other to some extent, whereas if you look at China, anything related to be standards or anything, they vote as a block. So ultimately that has much more power on what is standardized in these committees. So do you guys see any role of governments, be it US, Europe, helping and coalesce the Western companies coming together and make sure it address it, not necessarily counter it, what China is doing, but address it to some extent that the best technology wins, not who has more muscle power and power and numbers in those bodies. Thanks.
Thank you.
I could start, since I've thought a lot about that and heard a lot about that over the years. I do think that 3GPP might be, it's the anecdote that you hear about the most in this area, and so it might be somewhat outlier compared to the thousands of other standards bodies that exist. But that's why I think government should be involved to have the visibility, and really the headline I would say it's protect the integrity of the process. Every standards organization has its own set of rules, its own governance rules. So maybe those need to change at times if there's a problem. But the idea is to keep the private sector-led nature of setting the governance up, and to not then put the alternative is to have government having too heavy of a hand in these processes, which I don't think any of us want to see happen.
At the same time, I think we also need to identify when there is manipulation of these standard development organizations, whether it is expressly or not expressly, to make sure that the integrity of these processes are upheld.
Any ideas of what can be done? I mean, people understand it's a challenge, but I haven't seen anybody coming up with solutions as such.
I think it's actually very easy to analyze patterns in voting behavior and I think illuminate patterns that can't be explained through commercial interpretation, right? We do this all the time looking at Chinese growth rates like the reported January, February, great Chinese GDP performance doesn't correlate with any of the sub-indicators that we can see for what's going on in the economy. Likewise, you can simply look at voting patterns versus what companies say in their annual reports about what their intrinsic interests are in the marketplace and find discordancies. We're looking at the availability to do, is there enough data at the organization level? That gets back to the role of transparency. First, you make data and information transparent. Then you make sure everybody prioritizes using it and working from it. And then you go in and you do it. You look at it and try to figure out what you can say based on it. For instance.
So since we may not all be standards experts, 3GPP is the Global Standards Development Organization that uses a regional approach to developing the standards for telecommunications like 5G and whatever G is coming next. Other questions from the audience? Okay, seeing none. So thank you, panel. What do you think the United States government can do to help our industry be engaged in standards development activities in a way that works for industry and protects the integrity of standards development globally for technologies? Wonderful.
Well, I think that, the previous panel alluded to this. We don't want the government, we don't want to mimic China. That we do have an august principle that the government should keep its hands off in certain ways and with private corporations. On the other hand, I think the government certainly could have a convening function. I mean, maybe they ought to get all the major players together to say, all right, how are you going to do this? What help might you need that isn't too intrusive? These are the kinds of things I think we have to consider once we recognize that we are at this inflection point. There are many implications in many areas of endeavor where we've been doing things a certain way. And I think going forward, almost every aspect of our engagement in the world is going to be conditioned by the new realities that we see in the Ukraine. And dare I say it, it's not absolutely analogous, but if Putin has his Ukraine, Xi Jinping has Taiwan. And what's on Taiwan? TSMC and 92% of all of the high-end chip fab manufacturing. And this has to be, it seems to me, on people's horizon. Not that it will happen, but we didn't think Ukraine would happen. And what do we do then? What happens to our standard making, our standards setting organizations in regard to China? I mean, what are we going to do about Russia? It doesn't matter that much, but are we going to continue to embrace Russia in these kinds of global international organizations? It remains to be seen.
Thank you, Rob.
I think there's, aside from, I think, as mentioned a couple times, additional tax benefits for companies that put people forward to participate in standards bodies. I think there needs to be, again, not to undermine the private sector-led nature of these standards bodies, but to have a better dialogue between government and industry about the ways to be successful on priority technology areas. And I think two of those that I'd highlight are 5G, 6G. 5G will move into 6G through the 3G partnership process, 3GPP, over the period of next 4 or 5 years. That will become the 6G standards. And in artificial intelligence, I'll explain the acronyms. The International Standards Organization, the International Electrotechnical Commission, ISO, IEC, have a joint technical committee 1, which basically sets all the digital standards globally, or can in some ways. There are other standards bodies, but they're really important. They have a group that is working on artificial intelligence standards. It's important that the US and Western interests have a key role in promoting and promulgating these standards in an expeditious fashion, because the concerns about AI are about explainability, bias, transparency, and risk management. There's going to be standards developed across all of those. It's really important for industry to be in there with the best of ideas, promoting the best solutions to the concerns in those areas. And so I think that's where government can be talking to industry about encouraging them to participate, not telling them exactly what to do, but having this conversation that encourages more participation. I think that's going to be really important, especially if you see block voting in something like 3GPP, but even in ISO IEC, that's likely to be a set of standards that can be adopted worldwide. As Europe's going to implement their Artificial Intelligence Act, they're going to base all high-risk applications will have to meet a conformity assessment. And that conformity assessment should be based on a global standard, and that's where we have a real opportunity to lead and we should put the time in to do that.
All right, Rama.
I also want to emphasize that our democratic values and norms are baked into AI at the design and development stages. So it's really important that in these standard setting processes that we promote democratic values and norms as a national interest. The National Security and Commission on AI issued a document called the Key Considerations for the Responsible Design and Development and Deployment of AI. And they are operationalizing practices for implementing principles like explainability and transparency and accountability. And so those kind of best practices need to be referred to in the standard making processes as well to make sure that democratic values and norms are being considered.
Thank you. So I'll give a plug. NIST is developing a risk management framework for artificial intelligence, much like the cybersecurity framework, and it will really set the stage for a lot of the standards development that Rob mentioned, and those standards will be the way that artificial intelligence systems are assessed to determine their trustworthiness, which is going to be a key part in deployment of artificial intelligence in actual applications, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a societal perspective. I see we have another question up front.
Wanted to move the conversation to a little bit farther down the road, because the problem is we can talk about standards and how important it is to be involved, but once you get the standards, then you have to figure out what they mean for purposes of the intersection with IP. And what we have right now is courts all over the world fighting with each other. We have antisuit injunctions, anti-suit injunctions, and actually triple that. There's been a lot of discussion about maybe things like what the parameters of fair and reasonable should be, that should be baked into the standards, and the organizations are all resisting it, or that perhaps there should be some kind of a global remedy that parties can turn to. And the problem is that it seems like China is benefiting a lot from the rest of the countries in the world fighting with each other. So is there anything to be done?
Thank you. Just identify yourself.
Oh, I'm sorry, Judge O'Malley.
Thank you. And I'll go to our ringer here for IP, Rama.
So I think one of the things we could do is make sure that explore ways that government officials can be exploring these legal disputes in foreign jurisdictions related to FRAND and SEP litigations to make sure that that national sovereignty for the United States is being upheld.
Other questions from the audience? I see one over on my left. Hold the mic a little closer, please. And identify yourself, please.
Maybe that's odd. I want to get to one thing here. We've been talking about China as one sort of homogenous country, and everything in China is homogenous. But we also need to think there are a lot of different actors in China. You know, ZTE and Huawei are major competitors, for example. How do we think about sort of more this dynamic that might be exploited in some ways to help us?
Can you identify yourself, please?
Sure, Ed Tiedemann, Qualcomm.
Thank you. And Orville, take a shot.
Well, you know, the thing that's unique about China is that, yes, you have different companies, and yes, they are in competition, but they actually, when push comes to shove, they all have to answer to the government. So it's increasingly difficult, particularly with the pandemic. I mean, we are sort of metaphorically decoupled because of the pandemic from China. Now, what happens in terms of supply lines is another question. But it gets increasingly difficult, I think, for us to think about playing one company off against another. They don't have that kind of latitude. The final thing I would simply say about that is we also have to recognize that we've had some enormous changes, but this isn't a steady state situation we've now arrived at, a new steady state situation. It's a constantly fluxing situation.
Let me add to that. It's not an argument with you, Orville, but there's a danger in crediting too much Beijing's ability to force everybody into alignment on the issues, right? Certainly on the things that matter, the very most in Beijing, if they want to keep their focus on it, they can pretty much force everyone to get into the same alignment. But they can't get everybody to do everything they want all the time at all. And even, whether it's between the telecom majors or any of the other highly concentrated tech players or atomized tech players, there's kind of what Beijing says, read my lips, this is how it's going to work. And then, you see firms go out and behave in ways that Beijing absolutely does not intend, including in their global foreign direct investment behavior, in the way they move assets in and out of their businesses, the way they take on debt, all sorts of things. So, China has given us a smoking gun by making it national doctrine that they don't want unhealthy competition between their firms when those firms go global. They're essentially saying, we're going to have, everybody's part of a singularity called having a Communist Party director in every firm, which is sort of prima facie a kind of element of collusive intent, right? But then the actual behaviors are much more atomized, fragmented, and uncoordinated in many cases. So there's a lot of complexity. And the one thing I want to sort of warn us against is the more we credit them with being able to do that, the more that plants the seed in some clever minds on Capitol Hill that we should probably do it too. Because if it works for China, I mean, as you said, Judge, they seem to be going from strength to strength in this environment. Well, that narrative kind of tells everybody in the world, well, this looks like it's kind of inevitable that China becomes the biggest economy in the world. Looks like it's inevitable that if they say that they want to do something, they're going to do it. So resistance is futile. Don't try to change that or get in the way of it. Just get the best terms you can, and do what you have to do. I think that is entirely an incorrect reading of how China is actually doing today and how fragile in many ways its choices are that seem to give it strengths in the moment, but are actually profoundly problematic. And for just most immediately, I want to make sure that we don't upload any of those bad choices in the misperception that they might be good for us.
Thank you. So another question right here in the center.
Hi, Jonathan Barnett. I'm at the University of Southern California School of Law. You've been talking about, and I've learned a great deal about potential manipulation of standard setting for protectionist purposes by the Chinese government or Chinese-guided entities. But we have a good deal of evidence of manipulation of SDO rules and policies by implementer entities, irrespective of nationality. Attempted changes in rules to limit the ability to seek injunctions, to cap royalty rates, to set the point in the licensing, the supply chain at which components should be licensed. All of these have in common that they would rig the FRAN negotiation process up front to depress the royalty rates. 2 administrations ago, the US antitrust policies actually actively encouraged SDOs to adopt these policies. We currently have draft SEP policy guidelines that are being advocated by the current administration. How can this possibly be reconciled with a US national interest in seeking fairly negotiated remuneration for US innovators and to preserve their incentives to participate in the standard setting, which could not even take place without the innovations that they have developed? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll start with Ram.
Wow, that's the third rail question. Especially for someone who's at a trade association that represents companies across the full spectrum in the marketplaces. I will say, the WTO technical barriers to trade standard for a standards body is one that's open, it's transparent in how it reviews drafts and promulgates revisions, and is consensus based. I think beyond that, we need to have a diversity of governance structures out there. And the governance structure will in some ways determine the success of the standards organization. So I think we're going to see that play out over time. If the rules for governance that are selected or voted upon by its members are not useful, then people will go to other standards organizations.
So standards is a marketplace as well. Rama?
I'm going to pass that on.
All right, any other takers? Some other questions from the audience? So we've heard a lot about China and standards today, but I'm going to ask a little bit more nuanced question here. So I'm interested in the views of the panelists on China's approach to standards, but also in the European Union's. Recently, the European Union published a standardization strategy that's relatively new for them. So I have an interest in hearing what the panelists have to say about that.
I can start because I think I'm one that probably suggested that as a topic. So in February, the European Union released its European Standards Strategy. And some of you may know that really follow standards closely. The Europeans have 3 chartered standards bodies. And when they want to make a standard that's harmonized for all of Europe, that is, it gives it the legal import of the presumption that if you comply with it, you're complying with whatever regulation that's sought to be aligned with that standard. The only people who get to vote on the final standard are the member countries' standards bodies. So it is not fully representative, and it's certainly not representative of interests outside of Europe. So it creates a substantial problem of lining those types of standards, which are really European only, with the international standards that I think most Western companies want to participate in, want to create. The Europeans go down a road that is somewhat protectionist because they want to orient, in many cases, international standards with a European focus that make it difficult for outside players to participate, at least in some cases. The other thing that they highlight in their standard strategy is they want the opportunity to make technical specifications in many cases. So that is government actors from the European Commission deciding technical specifications. And where the rubber is really going to hit the road on this is, again, in artificial intelligence. When they promulgate and finalize their Artificial Intelligence Act, it'll require conformity assessments against standards. And those standards need to be global standards, not ones that are European only, because it would be harder to meet, fragment the market. And also if there are somehow other technical specifications engineered into them that don't meet the global standard, it could well be prioritizing the interests of Europeans over the global market, so and be quite protectionist in the end.
So just making another observation and going back to the antisuit injunctions. And in the last 2 years, China, and I'm not implying that Chinese jurisdictions are the only ones issuing antisuit injunctions, but in the last 2 years, China's courts have issued 4 antisuit injunctions. 3 of them favored Chinese companies. And last year, the U.S. Trade Representative raised concerns that this is a problem for international trade. And EU also raised similar concerns and filed an RFI asking for information on how China approaches antisuit injunctions, the guidance that it deploys. And China said, no, we don't have to answer that RFI. We do comply with the TRIPS agreement, and that these discussions should happen through bilateral discussions. But I do think that that's also something that needs to be addressed.
Audience questions? So one of the things that I'm very interested that I also heard was working with our allies and partners in standards. We have a private sector-led standard system where industry decides where it wants to go make standards, brings its contributions to the table. So how do we work with our allies and partners best in this dynamic standards environment in a way that supports our private sector-led standard system?
Well, one observation I would make is that what has happened in the last couple of months has actually made the EU come together, made the transatlantic alliance come together in a much more close and operational way, and also is beginning to make the Trans-Pacific Alliance. Now, in that case, it's been largely sort of military. There's the Quad, and I think with the Korean elections and the new president from the Conservative Party in Korea, even Korea may come on board. The real question is, can we elaborate out from what are predominantly military alliances like NATO and the Quad to have other mechanisms in place, perhaps to come to the defense of a country when it becomes the victim, as Australia did, let's say, of Wolf Warrior diplomacy. And I think we see that actually happening to a degree which is quite surprising, not complete to be sure. But so I think that is going to influence all of our discussions around technology and standard settings as well, because it represents a recognition of a new need to have closer federation and closer cooperation.
Thank you. Daniel?
Yeah, so it seems to me that the boundaries around what was not just commercial and pedestrian, sort of everyday in its significance for national security, the boundary of that has gotten really unstable in recent years, right? So things that we never thought of as potentially weaponizable or problematic from a national security perspective, suddenly that border has just blown up, right, by an order of magnitude. And it's happened so quickly, it's gone much faster than the ability of governments, policymakers, other participants in the public discussion within the OECD community, within the liberal market democracy community, right, to catch up to that and figure out how to manage that rapidly shifting borderline between what can be pretty much left to purely commercially minded solutions versus what things are going to need the special attention that I was talking about before. And so in order to just create the potentiality for more harmonization in how we think about this, whether it's firm-led or government-led, the first problem, again, is an informational problem. How we define theories of concern, right? And whether we can create that definition in a shareable, joint way so that we can both work from the same basic understanding of what is legitimately problematic vis-a-vis China in terms of their interoperability with our systems, our societies, whether it's issues to do with the erosion of our values and human rights or our long-term economic competitiveness. It's got to start with acknowledging, this is an unstable time for defining those boundaries around what isn't so normal anymore, right? It was twisting arms with our German friends 4 years ago to get them to look at 5G the same way that Rob and his colleagues were thinking about the theories of concern in that sector. It is no longer really, right? There's been a tremendous amount of progress in that area, I would say. But in so many areas, there's still a long way to go in terms of sharpening up our sense of the edges around what is not just an everyday sector. And we're just going to have to accept that and deal with it for a little while if we want to create the premise of engageability among the liberal market democracies, it seems to me.
Thank you. Go ahead, Rob.
I agree with all that. And I'd also say that we need a recommitment through trade policy to international standards. The World Trade Organization decades ago created something called the Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement, which said that if you're going to promulgate a regulation and there's an international standard that's applicable, you must use that. And there's some fine exceptions to it, but that's generally the trend. That's been the case for goods, but not for digital services. And as everyone knows, we've moved very much from a goods economy to digital services being much more important. So we need to try to have that kind of standard for digital services, that they should be based on international standards wherever possible in all kinds of trade agreements. So as the administration goes to propose the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or hopefully eventually revisit the TPP arrangement. We should look at digital services, a commitment that all countries use international standards. That'll provide a demand signal for an increasing number of goods, increasing number of reasons for people to be in the international standards game. There's a great opportunity now too with the European Union. There's this US-EU Trade and Technology Council. It was started last June when President Biden visited the Europeans. They had their first meeting last fall. They'll have another meeting here in May. And the top ask that ITI and some of us have is you should base wherever possible, especially on emerging tech, all standards, all regulations on international standards. And there's 10 working groups in this US-EU construct, and one of them is focused only on standards. So there's a real, I think, possibility for there to be a political commitment between the US and EU, especially talking about the geopolitics of alignment here, to really focus on international standards for regulation, again, hitting the same notes of AI, 6G, other areas where for emerging tech, we need to have international standards.
Thank you. And I'll just give a pitch since I am one of the co-leaders of this working group
right.
one under the US-EU TTC. If you have things that you'd like to see us consider talking about, there's actually an email box specifically for working group one on standards and TTC, or you can send it to me and I'll make sure it gets considered. I want to really have a moment to thank the audience for your excellent questions and attention, and thank our panelists for their great discussion. Thank you.